Darkness stretched beyond the viewport, vast and endless, swallowing even the faintest starlight. The ship drifted through the void, silent, alone, and yet, something felt wrong. The crew of the ISS Nightfall had been traveling for weeks, mapping out the farthest reaches of known space. Their mission was routine scan, log anomalies, and move on. Simple. Safe. Nothing out here but dust and echoes. Or so they thought. It started small. Shadows that didn't match their sources. A flicker of movement in the corner of an eye. Reflections in the glass that lingered just a second too long. No one spoke of it at first. They were scientists, explorers, professionals. Space was strange. Light behaved oddly in the deep black. Brains played tricks when surrounded by nothing for too long. But then the readings changed. The ship's scanners picked up something impossible, a structure where nothing should be. Not a planet, not a moon, not even debris. Just a void within the void. Something massive, swallowing the sensor pulses like they were never sent at all. A ghost ship.
Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content.
The name stuck before anyone could object. It wasn't a derelict wreck, not some abandoned hulk from a forgotten war. This thing wasn't in any database. No records, no distress signals, no signs it had ever existed. Just waiting there, suspended in the abyss. The captain hesitated. They could leave. Mark it as an anomaly and move on. But the scientist in them, the human in them, couldn't. So, they boarded. The airlock groaned as it connected. Atmosphere checks, pressure locks, all standard. The hatch opened with a hiss, revealing a corridor beyond. The walls were sleek, metal darker than any alloy they knew, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The team stepped inside, their boots echoing in a place that shouldn't have sound. Then, the door shut behind them. The lights on their suits flickered. A static hum buzzed through the comms, just faint enough to set teeth on edge. One of them turned, glancing at the entrance, but the hatch was still there. Still real. And yet something had changed. The corridor felt longer. It wasn't. They had measured it, mapped it in real time. But their eyes told a different story. The walls seemed to stretch when they weren't looking. Angles bent in ways that didn't make sense. And their own shadows twitched when they stood still. Then the first scream rang through the comms. The scream tore through the comms, sharp and raw, cutting through the stale air like a knife. For a split second, no one moved. No one even breathed. It wasn't just a scream, it was the kind of sound that came from pure, primal terror. Someone's suit light flickered wildly as they turned, searching for the source. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, shaking, their breathing ragged through the open channel. I saw something, they gasped. The others closed in, hands gripping weapons, flashlights sweeping over the corridor walls. Nothing. Just the same dark, metallic surfaces. Silent. Still. But that didn't mean nothing was there. What did you see? Someone asked. A pause. A shuddering breath. My reflection. It didn't move. No one spoke. The only sound was the static hum in their ears, faint, almost like whispering beneath the surface. That's not possible, another voice cut in. They were trying to sound calm, but there was a sharpness in their tone, something close to fear. The one who screamed turned, their visor catching the dim light. I swear. I stepped forward, and my reflection, it just stood there. Watching me. And then. It smiled. That sent a chill through them all. Someone swore under their breath. This wasn't just an abandoned ship. This wasn't just some derelict lost to time. Something was wrong here. They pressed forward, forcing themselves to move, to focus on the mission. The ship had to have a control room, a power core, something that would tell them what this place was. But as they walked, the corridors seemed different. Subtle things. A junction that should have been behind them now ahead. A doorway they hadn't passed yet standing slightly open, as if waiting. The air felt thick, like walking through unseen currents, like they were being watched from every angle. Then the lights flickered. Not their suit lights, the ship's. Soft, distant. A slow pulse, as if the ship had taken a breath. And that's when they realized something terrifying. They weren't alone in here. One of them turned too fast, hand tightening on their weapon. Did you hear that? No one had. They swallowed, scanning the darkness beyond their lights. Their voice was quieter now, shaken. Footsteps. I heard footsteps. They stood frozen, straining to listen. But there was nothing. Just silence. Someone let out a nervous laugh. Paranoia, they muttered. We're hearing things. But were they? They pushed on, forcing themselves to keep moving. Every step forward felt harder, heavier, as if something was pushing back against them. Then they reached the first room. A large space, wide and open, unlike the corridors. The walls stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness. The only thing inside was a console dimly lit, flickering, like it was barely holding on to power. One of them stepped forward, hand hovering over the controls. Their breath was unsteady. This system is old, they murmured. Really old. Another joined them, scanning the interface. The symbols on the screen weren't human. They weren't any known language. But the interface. It was familiar. Almost too familiar. Then the screen glitched. The static rose. And suddenly their reflections in the screen didn't match. The entire team froze. One by one, they turned their heads, scanning the dim surface. Their reflections were there. Almost right. Almost. But their movements were a second too slow. Someone reached for their helmet, their fingers trembling. This isn't real, they whispered. And then their reflection moved before they did. It tilted its head, watching them, its lips curling into a slow, unnatural grin. And then it stepped out of the glass. The reflection stepped out. Not shattered. Not distorted. Just walked forward, like it had always been real. Like it had been waiting. The team stumbled back, weapons raised, but no one fired. Not yet. Not when they couldn't understand what they were seeing. The thing that had been their reflection looked like them. Same suit. Same stance. But its movements were just a little off. Too smooth. Too precise. And then it tilted its head, mimicking their every breath, every twitch of their fingers, except there was no hesitation. Someone whispered through the comms, their voice barely holding together. We need to leave. Right now. But no one moved. Because the moment they spoke, the thing did too. Only, its voice didn't come from the suit. It came from everywhere. The speakers in their helmets, the walls, the ship itself, the same words, repeated back in a chorus. But not in the same tone. No. It was warped, stretched, like someone was learning to speak for the first time. Then more reflection shifted in the screen. All of them. And then, one by one, they stepped out. Panic broke loose. Someone shoved away from the console, breathing too hard, backing into the nearest wall. Another tried to raise their weapon, but their hands were shaking. The air itself felt heavier, pressing down, thick and cold. One of the copies moved. Not walking just there, suddenly closer than it should have been. Too fast. Too wrong. It reached out, just a small movement, like an offer. And then it spoke again, but this time, it used a name. Not a rank. Not a call sign. A real name. One of theirs. But not just that. It spoke in their own voice. A perfect copy. A sound pulled straight from memory. It smiled. And whispered something that no one else should have known. Something private. Something buried. A word, a moment, a secret thought. Something it couldn't have heard. A sharp breath. A stumble back. How do you? The thing tilted its head again, wider this time, like it was studying the effect. Like it enjoyed it. And then the lights flickered. The copies vanished. No movement. No retreat. Just gone. The only sound was the static still humming in the comms, crawling under their skin like something unseen was breathing just behind them. One of them cursed, voice shaking. That's it. We're done. We're out. But then the ship spoke. Not in warnings. Not in alarms. In their own voices. And it said, "You already belong to us." The words echoed in their helmets, unnatural, slipping through the air like a creeping fog. You already belong to us. The ship had spoken. But how? How could it know them so intimately? Everyone froze. The command deck, once bustling with activity and the hum of equipment, now felt like a tomb. The static in their comms wasn't just noise. It was a voice. Their voices. Overlapping, distorting, pulling their words into something unrecognizable. No one dared to move. For a moment, the only thing that was certain was the cold, oppressive air. Their breaths fogged inside their visors as they stood still, terrified to look at each other. Terrified to look behind them. One of them, shaking, reached for a panel beside the door. A command interface, cold and unfeeling. The faintest flicker of hope. We can fix this. We can override the system. We just need to get the core back online. But their hands trembled as they keyed in the sequence. The ship was listening. It always had been. The thought burned through them. The sensors on their suits, the heartbeat monitors, everything the ship knew them. Not as crew, not as strangers. It knew them as if they were part of it. The lights flickered again, more intensely this time. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift. The reflections. They were back. Not in the glass this time, but in the dark corners of the walls, behind the doors, in the spaces between breaths. They moved like smoke, slithering across the surfaces, their forms flickering and distorting. A hand shot out of the corner of the room. Thin, skeletal, and wrong. It wasn't human. It shouldn't have been there. The others shouted, pulling their weapons up, firing. The bullets pierced the air, but they never hit anything. Another figure appeared. Taller this time. Darker. Its features never stayed the same. One moment a face, the next only shifting shapes, contorting into something not human. The ship's voice came again, but it was no longer in their own voices. Now, it was different, deep and guttural, warping in a way that made their very bones ache. You can run. But you can't hide. And then the floor shifted. A low rumble, as though the ship itself was waking, stretching, shifting its form. The lights cut out completely. Panic exploded. They moved running, shouting, the corridor ahead of them twisting impossibly, bending, becoming an endless tunnel. No matter how fast they ran, the door was never closer. The walls closed in on them, squeezing the air from their lungs. Their breathing quickened, fast and sharp, the sound echoing in their ears. They tried to find their way back, to retreat to the docking bay, to escape, but the ship had turned against them. The very walls seemed to pulse as they moved through the ship, like it was alive. Like it was watching. The reflections were always there. Watching. Mimicking. Always behind them, but not. Their movements were too exact, too precise. When they turned their heads, they could see them in the corner of their vision, figures walking where they had just been, following them, smiling the same cold smile. Their own eyes flicked from side to side, looking for any way out, but the ship felt smaller, tighter. It was trapping them. One of them stopped, a gasp caught in their throat. "This is it," they whispered, their voice trembling with something more than fear. "This is what happened to the last crew. They're not dead. They're here. Just like us." The thought hit like a hammer. The ship wasn't just haunting them. It had taken them. Piece by piece, bit by bit, the crew had been absorbed into it. The ship had become them, and now they were part of it too. How much longer until they disappeared? The door behind them slammed shut, trapping them in the dark. Desperation hit them all at once. They had to move. They had to escape. Then, a whisper. It came from the walls. From the very air. So soft, they almost missed it. But it wasn't the ship. It wasn't the reflections. It was one of them. One of the crew. A voice, broken. "It's not what you think. We're not the first." A wave of cold rushed over them. A sudden, overwhelming realization. The truth hung there, suspended in the air, thick with danger. This ship wasn't just a random piece of lost technology. It was something older. Something far older. The walls seemed to breathe, the ship pulsing like a living organism. Something was waiting. In the darkness, a low laugh echoed, distorted, coming from nowhere, everywhere. The reflections, they were closer now. They had never left. And when the crew reached for their weapons, when they turned to face whatever was hunting them, they realized too late. Their own faces were staring back at them from the shadows. And the ship had made its decision. The real crew had already been absorbed. Now, it was their turn. The moment they realized the truth, the crew had already been absorbed, they froze. The air thickened around them, as though the ship itself had become a living thing, and it was feeding. It was feeding on them, on their fear, on the way their minds scrambled for an escape that was no longer possible. The walls pulsed again, a deep, resonating hum that made the blood in their veins feel like it was slowing, thickening, turning to ice. It wasn't just their faces in the shadows anymore. Now, they could see figures forming in the walls, distorted reflections, yes, but not like before. These were different. The edges of the figures were rippling, like they were still trying to become real, still trying to push their way out of the ship itself. The walls, the floors, the ceilings, they were no longer just metal and circuitry. They were shifting, bending, becoming something alive. The ship wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a prison. The crew spun, weapons raised, but they were no longer sure what they were aiming at. The reflections, the figures, they weren't just copies of them. They were something else. Something more. They had the same faces, the same features, but their eyes, they were empty. Hollow. Void of anything human. A voice, soft, like it was coming from somewhere far away, whispered in the darkness. It sounded too familiar. But when one of them turned, when they strained their ears to listen, the voice came again. Louder this time. Clearer. "It's too late," it said. "We've already found you." They all whipped around. One of them lifted their gun, ready to fire at anything that moved, but no shot came. It wasn't the ship they feared. It wasn't even the reflections anymore. It was something far worse. Something that had been here long before them. A second voice, this time cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're not the first aboard this ship," it said, colder than the freezing air around them. But it wasn't coming from the reflections. It wasn't even coming from the walls. It was coming from inside them. Inside their own minds. A whisper that crawled under their skin made their thoughts twist and fracture. "Who is that?" One of them gasped, struggling to stay grounded. Their voice was frantic, but there was no mistaking the panic in their tone. Another voice, quieter, trembling, broke through the static. This isn't just a ship. This is the Black Ghost." And then, everything stopped. The ship fell silent, except for the low hum of the air recyclers. The walls stood still. The shadows receded. The reflections in the distance were gone. The figures were no longer there, and for a moment, it felt like the terror had just been a trick. A moment of madness. But as they lowered their weapons, trying to breathe and think and stay sane, the lights flickered one last time. And in that flicker, a new reflection appeared. It was them. Not just one of them. It was all of them. A perfect duplicate, standing side by side. No distortion, no ripples. But the eyes were different. They were dark. Hollow. The reflections didn't even blink. And then, one by one, they moved. Not in sync. Not by any natural means. They stepped forward in silence. Each figure moving in its own direction, their limbs stretching too far, bending too sharply. They weren't just reflections anymore. They were something else entirely. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. No, not a shadow. A shape. One that was taller, darker than the rest. Its form seemed to shift as it moved, constantly changing. It was no longer human. It tilted its head, studying them, and the thing that looked like a reflection spoke again. But now, it was no longer mimicking their voices. It had its own voice. One deep and resonant, like it was coming from a place far beyond their understanding. "You think you're in control?" It asked, its voice filling the room, shaking the walls. "You think you can escape? You can never leave." They weren't trapped in the ship. They were the ship. Every part of them, every piece of their consciousness had been absorbed, just like the previous crews before them. They had thought they were still themselves, still human, but now they were nothing more than echoes, drifting in the black void that surrounded them. The ship had merged with them. The ship wasn't just a vessel anymore, it was a sentient being. The ground began to quake beneath their feet. The walls seemed to melt, contort into impossible shapes, and in that moment, they understood. They had become part of the Black Ghost's endless hunger. They had become the ship's new crew, and the cycle would repeat. One by one, they would lose themselves to the entity's will. The voices that had whispered to them earlier, the reflections, the creatures, it was all part of the ship's grand design. As the shadows surrounded them, one final, overwhelming truth broke through their minds: there was no escape. No one could leave the Black Ghost. The ship had already won. The figure, now fully formed, stood tall above them, its dark eyes looking down at them with an unsettling sense of familiarity. The voice spoke once more, this time clearer than ever. "You are now part of us. You have always been part of us." It was no longer a question. It was a declaration. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse into the darkness, something unexpected happened. The shadows faltered. The Black Ghost paused. A strange, unfamiliar hum began to reverberate through the ship. It wasn't the usual pulse, the malevolent hum of the entity. It was different, softer, more human. The crew, lost in their own thoughts, barely noticed at first. But then, as if the air itself had shifted, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't the deep, chilling tone of the Black Ghost. It was a voice they recognized. A human voice. "Can you hear me?" The voice called out, almost as though it was speaking directly to them, breaking through the oppressive weight of the ship. It wasn't coming from the ship's core. It wasn't coming from the shadows or the reflections. It was coming from somewhere else. It was a signal, a faint, broken transmission, but it was a signal nonetheless. The crew turned to each other, unsure whether they were hearing things, whether it was a trick or a mistake. But the hum was growing louder, more insistent. "We are still here," the voice continued, its tone filled with urgency. "We have been here before you, and we will be here after you. You are not alone. The ship is more than it seems. There is still a chance to break free." A sense of hope, no matter how small, flickered in their hearts. The ship that had consumed them, the Black Ghost, it wasn't invincible. There was something else, something beyond its reach. But as they turned toward the voice, trying to trace its source, the walls trembled again, and the Black Ghost gave a terrible, shuddering moan. The shadows seemed to grow larger, the reflections' eyes burning with fury. "You can't escape." The voice of the Black Ghost, now laced with anger, reverberated throughout the room. "You belong to me now." The last thing they heard before the darkness overtook them was the human voice, now more desperate, more frantic, cutting through the blackness one final time. "You can still fight it. You can still break free. Don't let it consume you." The crew stood motionless in the cold, suffocating darkness, feeling the weight of their defeat settle in like a crushing wave. The hum of the Black Ghost had faded, but the chilling sense of something ancient and malevolent still hung in the air, like a thick fog, wrapping itself around their minds. There was no escaping it now. Or so they thought. But then, the faintest flicker of light broke through the overwhelming blackness. At first, it was barely perceptible, a glimmer, a small shift in the shadows. But it grew, brighter, more defined, until the walls around them seemed to tremble as if the ship itself was acknowledging this new force that had entered its domain. The human voice from before pierced the silence again, this time clearer and more assertive. "Listen to me. You're not trapped. You're not alone in this." The crew, paralyzed by fear, instinctively tried to move, but the ship was holding them still, keeping them locked in place, their bodies heavy with the presence of the Black Ghost. But the voice, something about it made them listen. "Fight back," the voice urged, its tone filled with an urgency that resonated deep within their souls. "You can still resist." For a moment, they stood still, paralyzed by the overwhelming fear, but then a single thought broke through. They were not alone. There was something, someone, still reaching out from beyond the ship's control. And they could fight back. They had to. The crew didn't know how it happened or who was speaking to them, but there was something in the air, something in the very fabric of the ship that had begun to loosen its grip. It was almost as if the Black Ghost was not just a singular entity, but a captive, shackled by its own existence, by the cycles of death and consumption it had perpetuated over millennia. The crew, somehow, was part of that cycle, but they didn't have to be. In a sudden surge of adrenaline, they began to move. At first, it was small, just a shift of their bodies, a step forward. The walls groaned in protest, but they didn't stop. Their feet moved, faster now, almost as if they were being pulled by some unseen force. The Black Ghost had made its mistake, it had underestimated them. It had assumed they would accept their fate, become part of the ship's endless hunger. But they were not going down without a fight. The voice spoke again, clearer now, resonating in their minds like a gentle pulse. "Focus on the core," it said. "The heart of the ship? If you can destroy it, if you can break the cycle, the ship will lose its power over you. It will lose everything." And just like that, the path ahead became clear. It was the core. The ship had fed on so many before them, had twisted and turned them into its own, but the core, it was where the Black Ghost's true essence lay. If they could destroy it, they could break free. They could undo the horrors they'd witnessed. They could bring the ship's reign of terror to an end. The crew moved forward, closer to the center of the ship, closer to the heart of the Black Ghost. But the walls shifted, the shadows growing longer, darker. The closer they got to the core, the harder it became to stay focused. The air seemed to thicken, as if the ship was pushing back against them, trying to stop them from reaching its center. The hum of the walls became louder, more aggressive, almost like the ship was screaming. But they didn't stop. With every step they took, they could feel the Black Ghost's grip weaken. It was as if the walls themselves were fighting to hold onto them, trying to pull them back into the shadows, into its unending hunger. But with each step, the ship seemed to falter, as if something ancient was unraveling. The walls no longer hummed with energy. They whispered in fear, their voices lost beneath the weight of the crew's determination. And then, they reached the core. It was unlike anything they had imagined. The core wasn't a glowing orb or a pulsing machine. It was a massive, twisting mass of shadow, alive, breathing, expanding and contracting, pulsing with the life force of the ship itself. It was the center, the very source of the Black Ghost's power, the origin of its insatiable hunger. The crew didn't hesitate. They knew what they had to do. They moved in unison, working together despite the weight of their fear, despite the terror still trying to choke them. They placed explosives rigged up by the crew's last moments of clarity at the base of the core. And as they stepped back, the countdown began. They had moments. Moments to destroy it all. The core pulsed, reacting violently to their actions. It sent out waves of energy, jolting the walls, shaking the very foundation of the ship. The Black Ghost was fighting back, trying to stop them, trying to drag them back into its suffocating grasp. But the crew held strong. No, one of them whispered. It ends now. And with a final, deafening roar, the core exploded. The blast was unlike anything they had experienced. It was more than just light. It was pure destruction, the energy that had kept the Black Ghost alive for so long unraveling in an instant. The shadows retreated, the walls collapsed, the echoes of the ship's tormenting hum faded away. For a moment, everything was still. The crew, battered and exhausted, watched as the ship that had consumed so many was reduced to nothing. The Black Ghost was no more. But even as the explosion died down, as the ship began to break apart, there was one last moment of clarity. The voice, the human voice that had guided them, returned. It's over, it said, calm and steady. You're free. And just like that, they felt it, the weight lifting from their shoulders. The oppressive air, the grip of the Black Ghost, the overwhelming sense of fear and dread, it was all gone. The walls, the floors, the very ship had collapsed in on itself, leaving them in the eerie calm of space. The crew was still alive. They had done it. They had survived. But the question still lingered. Who had spoken to them? Who had helped them in their darkest hour? As they floated in the emptiness of space, drifting from the wreckage of the Black Ghost, the stars glittering in the distance, they couldn't help but wonder if there were others out there. Others who had faced the same darkness. Others who had been lost to the Black Ghost. The ship's hunger had been quelled, but the story was far from over. There were still echoes, whispers of those who had come before them. And somewhere, deep in the stars, they knew the Black Ghost wasn't done. It was gone for now, but it wouldn't stay silent forever. But for now, the crew had won. They had survived. And in the vast silence of space, their story became a legend. A legend of the Black Ghost. The ship that never dies.